right, Fireflies. Welcome to this episode of the Outer Brightness podcast. Tonight, we're going to talk about one of the Gospel Topics essays that the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints began publishing in, I think, 2012 or 2013, I think is when they first started publishing these. These essays are kind of important in the whole history of transparency from the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints regarding some of their history, events, and topics in their history, as well as topics within their doctrinal teachings. And in many ways, the Gospel Topics essays have been a catalyst for many Latter-day Saints beginning to question their faith when they encounter these essays. There has been some suggestion from the ex-Mormon community that the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints is even now not as transparent as they should be, because the Gospel Topics essays are sometimes difficult to find once you're on churchofjesuschrist.org. Unless you have a direct link, sometimes it's very difficult to find them. I don't find that to be the case within the Gospel Library app that I have on my phone. I can search up one of the titles of the Gospel Topics essays and it comes up. They come up pretty easily and readily available. But the reason why we're beginning a series of episodes, and it may take us a while to get through these. We're not going to go sequentially and do these one after the other. We'll have other interviews and conversational type episodes in between. But we're starting with this one, Becoming Like God, for several reasons. One, it's a really important topic. It's probably the topic, in my opinion, that separates the doctrine of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints from Orthodox Christianity. And the other reason is that Fred Anson, who we recently had on Outer Brightness, called out for us that this essay in particular, when you are in the Gospel Topics section of the churchofjesuschrist.org, where you can either access alphabetically these essays or other gospel topics, it's a resource for Latter-day Saints to use, that this particular essay, when you click on the link, is now redirecting to a different Gospel Topics essay titled Are Mormons Christian? So that's an interesting thing that's happening. It raises questions, again, about transparency. Is this being done intentionally? What might be the reason why they would set that link to redirect? Was it an accident? Did a church employee who is a web designer or developer accidentally change a link? That seems not believable, but here we are. So, Matthew, what do you think? Any thoughts on why they might redirect this particular essay and why they might redirect it to Are Mormons Christian?
Yeah, I guess you could go the conspiratorial route, I guess, and have, attribute maybe more devious notions, or, what's the word I'm looking for? Devious intentions behind why they redirect. I don't know. It might just be more, they're trying to really focus on LDS being Christian, and, along with the fact that they don't want to be even called Mormons anymore. They want to be just called Christian. So it might not be trying to hide this belief. It might just be really trying to switch their focus and trying to get the word out to everybody that, hey, LDS are Christians too. So I don't know. That's kind of what I thought.
Yeah, I appreciate you being willing to be charitable there. I tend to agree. We grew up. We were born and raised in the Latter-day Saint faith. I know, Matthew, you were more of a convert because you weren't baptized at the age of 8 as a child, and you decided later on to study it out for yourself and become a member of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints as a teenager. But I grew up in a time in Utah when are Mormons Christian was a really important question for Latter-day Saints and their identity, individually and collectively, as well as for the broader Christian world interacting with Latter-day Saints. And so this topic is one that kind of strikes close to home. I'll have some comments to share on that as we kind of go, but the plan tonight is to read through the essay. Matthew and I will switch off reading sections of it and then sharing our comments or asking each other questions about the content of each section of the essay. So without too much further ado, let's jump into it. Matthew, will you read the first section?
Certainly. So the first section is titled Overview. One of the most common images in Western and Eastern religions alike is of God as a parent and of human beings as God's children. Billions pray to God as their parent, invoke the brotherhood and sisterhood of all people to promote peace, and reach out to the weary and troubled out of deep conviction that each of God's children has great worth. But people of different faiths understand the parent-child relationship between God and humans in significantly different ways. Some understand the phrase "child of God" as an honorary title reserved only for those who believe in God and accept his guidance as they might accept a father's. Many see parent-child descriptions of God's relationship to humanity as metaphors to express his love for his creations and their dependence on his sustenance and protection. Latter-day Saints see all people as children of God in a full and complete sense. They consider every person divine in origin, nature, and potential. Each has an eternal core and is a beloved spirit son or daughter of heavenly parents. Each possesses seeds of divinity and must choose whether to live in harmony or tension with that divinity. Through the atonement of Jesus Christ, all people may progress toward perfection and ultimately realize their divine destiny, close quote. Just as a child can develop the attributes of his or her parents over time, the divine nature that humans inherit can be developed to become like their heavenly fathers. The desire to nurture the divinity in his children is one of God's attributes that most inspires, motivates, and humbles members of the church. God's loving parentage and guidance can help each willing, obedient child of God receive of his fullness and of his glory. This knowledge transforms the way Latter-day Saints see their fellow human beings. The teaching that men and women have the potential to be exalted to a state of godliness clearly expands beyond what is understood by most contemporary Christian churches and expresses for the Latter-day Saints a yearning, rooted in the Bible, to live as God lives, to love as he loves, and to prepare for all that our loving Father in heaven wishes for his children.
Quick question. Do you hear the tone when I come off of mute?
No.
Okay. That's only on my side. That's cool. All right. So let's talk about this section really quick. Do you have any thoughts general thoughts you want to share on this section?
Man, like the more I've been studying Aquinas and confessionalism and divine simplicity, I was just reading that and just my my ears are ringing with the heresy alarm, just buzzing off, because when you look at the early councils, when the debates over who Christ is, their view is that Christ is God because he's divine, and divinity is something that differentiates God from every other being. So in parts of this where it says that, the part where I said, Latter-day Saints see all people as children of God in a full and complete sense. They consider every person divine in origin, nature, and potential. If an early church father were to hear this, they would read that and see, oh, they're saying that we are just as much God as God is. They didn't understand the divine nature to change or to become. In that same paragraph, it says, just as a child can develop the attributes of his or her parents over time, the divine nature that humans inherit can be developed to become like their heavenly fathers. So it's they see, or at least according to this Gospel Talk, the essay, the way they're describing it is that the divine nature is something that is corrupt or imperfect, and it can become a perfected divine nature. And such a thing is like completely foreign to the entire church. So, so those are kind of thoughts that I had.
Yeah. Yeah. Interesting. I agree with you. As I was reading through it in preparation for this episode, I noted that the essay doesn't really begin with a doctrine of God and God's nature. Rather, it begins with a doctrine of man or humanity and its potential. And so it immediately kind of took my mind to when I was first beginning to study systematic theology and reading about theocentric theologies versus anthropocentric theologies. A theocentric theology begins with God and God's nature, what kind of being God is, and then works from there to creation, humanity, sin, the fall, salvation, and ultimately the whole plan of God. But this essay, focuses immediately on kind of what Latter-day Saints see as the potential of humanity. So it kind of marks Latter-day Saint theology as an anthropocentric theology. And so what I mean by that is human-centered, right? And a lot of times when we talk to Latter-day Saints online, yes, there is a focus, as there is here in the essay, on God as parent. But there is also very much a focus from Latter-day Saints on their own potential, what they can become. And it's very human-centered. And there's a reasoning when they think about who God is, they reason from the human to the divine, right? We are physical. We are alive, and we will eventually be like God, as this essay claims. And so they reason from our nature as humans to, well, God must be like that, only better, right? And that way of thinking, that way of reasoning in an anthropocentric way, in a human-centered way, is driven by their theology. It's something that they come by honestly through receiving the teachings of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. I don't fault them for it, but I'd just like to call out that is what they do, and it's what I did until I no longer believed the unique truth claims of the Latter-day Saint movement and branched outside of that faith. So that's just kind of my overall initial thoughts on this section, but I wanted to kind of focus in on a couple of things that are said within as well. There's the line that says, some understand the phrase child of God as an honorary title reserved only for those who believe in God and accept his guidance as they might accept a father's. So Matthew, isn't that the biblical view that we are adopted as children of God, as kind of called out in, for example, John 1:12?
Yeah, when we got to that line, I am not quite entirely sure if they're saying that if that was a direct reference to what Christians believe, or maybe they're trying to be general and say, well, not specifically Christians. But yeah, that's one thing I thought about that. But in terms of what we believe, I think it's partially true, because it sounds like, let me reread that. Let's see, as honorary title reserved only for those who believe in God and accept his guidance as they might accept a father's. So it seems like it's describing that father sonhood or parent or father childhood to a Christian, if that's what it's referring to, is what Christians believe. It seems like they're saying that it's more of just like a mentor-mentee relationship, like God gives instructions and you follow them, and that's what makes you father and son. But I think the Christian view of adoption is much more than just a mentor-mentee relationship. It's we're becoming, we know God in a personal and loving way. God knows us. We strive to become like him. We love and worship him. We strive to become conformed to Christ's image, and the Holy Spirit works in us to do so, to work us to become like Christ. And so it's not just God gives us directions and we follow them. There is a real relationship there. There is a loving relationship there. So it's part of the way there, but not quite. What do you think about that?
Yeah, I agree with that. And I would go a step further that, the big difference here is, what's being set up here in the essay is the idea that we can become like God because we are already like God by nature. There's not a creator-creature distinction between God and humanity. And so that to me is very different than, you said your heresy meters were going off. That to me is very different than what I see in the Bible. So, for example, John 1:12-13 says, "But as many as received him," referring to Jesus Christ, "to them gave he power to become the sons of God, even to them that believe on his name, which were born not of blood, nor of the will of the flesh, nor of the will of man, but of God." So when believers are adopted children of God, it's a birth from above, right? It's a birth from God, as John 1:13 says, but it's not something that we have as humans by nature. As verse 12 says, "But as many received him, to them he gave power to become the children of God." So it's something that you receive from God as grace after you have received Jesus Christ as your Savior. So Latter-day Saints are they'll commonly say that we are literally children of God. And we've talked a little bit about it before in other episodes. Matthew, what do Latter-day Saints mean when they say literally children of God?
Yeah, I guess it depends on which Latter-day Saint you're talking to, but traditionally there was this view that in some form or fashion that God the Father, in conjunction with Heavenly Mother, so our heavenly parents, were in some form or fashion the literal parents of our spirits. So they don't really know how that works, but we were originally in eternity past spirit intelligences that were uncreated and eternal, just as God is uncreated and eternal. And these spirit intelligences were formed into spirit bodies by our heavenly parents. And then that became us in the pre-mortal life. So that's kind of how they were our literal parents.
All right. So just want to take a quick step back a little bit, talking again about the anthropocentric versus theocentric approach to theology. The approach you just kind of laid out there, which is the traditional Latter-day Saint view, right? Heavenly parents, in some form or fashion, we are spiritual offspring of those heavenly parents, at least the core essence of us, right? So our spirits or our intelligences are literal offspring of heavenly parents. That view, again, it's a very anthropocentric view. It reasons from what we know of existence and procreation between husband and wife, and it kind of casts that onto the heavens and onto God, right? And says God is this in nature because man is this in nature. So I want, the question as we're working through this essay, the question really is what is the truth? That's what, I think you and I, Matthew, both want Latter-day Saints to ask that question, right? What is the truth here? And the truth, what we can know of it depends on God, absolutely, and what God has revealed. I want to share a passage from The Faith Once for All, Bible Doctrine for Today, from Dr. Jack Cottrell, who I studied under at Cincinnati Bible Seminary. He says, the reality of absolute objective truth is grounded in the fact that a transcendent creator God exists. The existence of God is thus the fundamental basis for truth. Man is finite, bound by an egocentric predicament, but God is not. God is infinite in every respect, including his knowledge. He is omniscient, he knows all things, and he knows them absolutely. His knowledge is complete and perfect. Absolute truth does exist. It is the contents of the mind of God. This difference between God and man is rooted in the fact of creation. Man is in every respect a creature, and thus is limited by nature. God alone is the creator, the eternal one who brought man and everything else into existence out of nothing, ex nihilo. The distinction between creator and creature is a unique kind of being. He transcends all the limitations by which creatures are inherently bound. The existence of the transcendent creator God is the basis of absolutes of any kind. The mind of God is the prototype of all reason and logic. His very essence is logos, word, reason, logic. And he cites John 1:1 there. He invites us to come and reason with him. And he cites Isaiah 1:18 there. His infinite consciousness includes all possible knowledge about all things without gaps or errors. Thus, everything he says about himself, about the nature of man, about right and wrong, about sin and salvation, about heaven and hell, is true. Thus, God and God alone is the source of absolute truth. Matthew, what do you think about what Dr. Cottrell says there?
I don't have much to say other than, yeah, I agree with that. Makes a lot of sense.
So what I want Latter-day Saints to get from that is I want them to think about the teachings that they receive from Joseph Smith and his successors. And I know Latter-day Saints believe that these teachings are revealed, and that they were revealed to Joseph Smith. As we work through this essay, you'll see, I think, the author of this essay, who is anonymous, in several places note, well, we don't really know much about X, Y, or Z. And, my question there to Latter-day Saints will be, do we really not know much about X, Y, or Z, or is the X, Y, or Z being de-emphasized? And if it's being de-emphasized, but you believe Smith was a prophet and receiving revealed truth from God, why are those things being de-emphasized? Why is the full implication of what Smith taught explicitly being de-emphasized? Let's see. So the passage in the first section that says Latter-day Saints see all people as children of God in a full and complete sense. They consider every person divine in origin, nature, and potential. Each has an eternal core and is a beloved spirit, son, or daughter of heavenly parents. So, Matthew, you kind of noted that they are placing humans in the same category of deity that God is in, correct? Mm-hmm. Why is that a problem?
Well, LDS beliefs don't really make any kind of distinction between communicable and incommunicable attributes of God. So communicable meaning they're ones that can be communicated to us, or as those in the image of God, and incommunicable meaning those are unique completely to God, that their attributes solely belonging to God. That would include things like eternality, meaning like he's never changed, he's never come into existence, he's never died. In sense of his eternal divine nature, and so his divine nature doesn't change. His aseity, which is just a fancy word for saying that God is self. He's independent. He's doesn't rely on anyone else for his existence. He's completely singular, so there's only one of him, in all of existence. Things like that. So these are some of the incommunicable attributes of God that do not belong to creation and can't be given to creation. But in Latter-day Saint thought, they don't really make that distinction. Whereas communicable attributes would be like love and mercy and justice. And these are things that are demonstrated in God in a perfect way, and in us, they're analogically related in an imperfect way. And so some of these things we can learn and we can grow in these communicable attributes, but not in the incommunicable attributes. But LDS thought doesn't really make that distinction. It seems like we have just as much potential to be just as much God as God is. Now, they wouldn't say that they would become higher than God or that they would somehow cease to be subservient to God in any way, even if they reached exaltation. But they do believe that in every single way imaginable, basically, we can become just like God is. And that's, like you said, it just destroys the creator dynamic. It basically blends the lines to make us in every way conceivable God. And that's just a problem, because the Bible is just filled with Psalms that show how powerful and different and superior God is to mankind, and that God controls everything in the palm of his hand, and that he can harden the heart of Pharaoh. He can move the heart of the king as he wishes. God's in control of everything. But when you make us just like God is, then I don't know, it kind of flips the whole concept of who we are in relation to God on his head. And it goes back to what you're saying about being focused on who we are and on man, and then using that understanding to filter our way up to understand who God is. And that's not how we should do it. We should start with revelation, what God has revealed about himself, use that to have some kind of grasp on who God is, and use that to understand how we relate to God.
Yeah. Really good stuff there, Matthew. And, when I was first studying systematic theology and understanding the differences that you mentioned between communicable attributes of deity and incommunicable attributes of deity, with the Latter-day Saint view that's being presented here, there, as you noted, there are no incommunicable attributes of deity, because what Latter-day Saint theology says is that at its core essence, humanity is already divine. And when I first came out of the LDS Church, I had been spurred to read the writings of Augustine, because I once fancied myself to be, I wanted to be a fiction writer, and I had written several fictional short stories that were kind of based on my experience as a Latter-day Saint. And I did a lot of reading of other Latter-day Saint authors. So, Orson Scott Card is a famous science fiction writer. He wrote Ender's Game. He's a Latter-day Saint, and he, outside of Ender's Game, he's written many sci-fi and fantasy series, some of which explore aspects of Latter-day Saint thought and teachings. I did a lot of reading of Levi Peterson, and I'm not sure if you're familiar with his work or not, Matthew, but he wrote probably is the most famous Mormon novel. It's called The Backslider. And I really like that novel, like what he does with his characters in that novel. But he also has a collection of short stories called The Canyons of Grace. And in there's a story called St. Augustine. And I read that story, and after reading that story, I wanted to read, okay, who is this St. Augustine guy, and what can I learn about him? So I started reading, shortly after I left the LDS Church, I started reading Augustine's Confessions and The City of God. And I was mentioning at one point to someone on a Facebook discussion board that I was reading The City of God, and I was quoting something to them that I thought was relevant to our discussion we were having. And he asked me, why are you reading Augustine? Even though you've left the LDS Church, why would you read things that are part of the apostasy? What value could that hold? And I made the comment to that guy at the time, that hey, now that I'm out of the LDS Church, and I don't necessarily hold to this idea of this great apostasy where the church that Christ and his apostles built ceased to exist on the earth for 1700 years. Now that I didn't have that belief, I felt like all of Christian history, all of Christian doctrine, writings was mine to explore and devour and understand. And so that's why I was reading Augustine. And so, I'll share a couple of quotes tonight from Augustine and from some other church fathers, because I think it's important to read some of the things that they said. So I have a quote from first from Basil the Great and then from Augustine, related to this whole idea of are humans children of God by nature, or do we become children of God? So Basil the Great says this in a writing of his called Concerning Baptism. He says, when the soul has been clothed with the Son of God, it becomes worthy of the final and perfect stage and is baptized in the name of the Father himself, of our Lord Jesus Christ, who, according to the testimony of John, gave the power to be made sons of God. So Basil the Great viewed the potential of humanity to be the sons or the children of God, right? But he didn't view them as having that by nature. Augustine says this in his writing called On Nature and Grace. He says, when any person is considered to be among the children of God, such an achievement must not be considered to have been accomplished by their ability alone. This ability they have received through the grace of God, because they did not possess it in a nature that has become corrupted and depraved. So some of these I want to call out as we work through the essay. I've got one more from Augustine, and then we'll move on to something else. He says in Sermon 166.4, Augustine says, I mean, you are not being told not to be a human in the sense that you are to be a beast, but rather that you are to be among those to whom, quote, he gave the right to become the children of God, end quote. God, you see, wants to make you a God, not by nature, of course, like the one whom he begot, but by his gift and by adoption. For just as he, through being humbled, came to share your mortality, so through lifting you up, he brings you to share his immortality. So Augustine kind of is touching on some of the incommunicable attributes and communicable attributes of God there, right, Matthew? He's saying you don't possess immortality by nature. God does. The Son does, but humans don't. But because Christ became human, because he humbled himself and took on flesh, he will lift humanity to immortality, something that they don't possess by nature. And that kind of brings me to a question that I have as I read through this essay, Matthew, and I want to get your thoughts on it. So we've kind of noted that by saying that people are children of God, humans are children of God inherently and by nature are divine in origin. what is it about this idea of pre-existent intelligences that Latter-day Saints have in their theology that make it a quote unquote divine nature?
What does it make it? How does it make it a divine nature? Their pre-mortality as intelligences?
Right.
Trying to make sure I understand the question fully. So, well, I would say that they believe that God was also an intelligence, right? That he was once an intelligence that was like us, and then he was organized into a spirit body, and then he progressed to godhood. At least that's traditionally that's what was taught, is that God the Father was in every way like us, and that's from the King Follett Discourse. And I'll just quote that real quick because I had that up. It says, so this is Joseph Smith. It wasn't the discourse for a king, for those who don't know. His name was King Follett. It was his funeral discourse. So Joseph Smith says here, quote, "I will go back to the beginning before the world was to show what kind of a being God is. What sort of a being was God in the beginning? Open your ears here, all ye ends of the earth, for I'm going to prove it to you by the Bible and to tell you the designs of God in relation to the human race and why he interferes with the affairs of man. God himself was once as we are now and is an exalted man and sits enthroned in yonder heavens. That is the great secret. If the veil were rent today and the great God who holds this world in its orbit and who upholds all worlds and all things by his power was to make himself visible, I say if you were to see him today, you would see him like a man in form, like yourselves in all the person, image, and very form as a man. For Adam was created in the very fashion, image, and likeness of God and received instruction from and walked, talked, and conversed with him as one man talks and communes with another." Close quote. So he basically talks later on how he says, quote, "We have imagined and supposed that God was God from all eternity. I will refute that idea and take away the veil so that you may see," close quote. So Smith basically talks about how in every single way imaginable, God is exactly like us. So we are divine in the sense that it's kind of reverse. It's not that we are divine. It's that God is in every way like a human. So there really is no distinction between the divine and the human nature. It's the same thing. But like you were talking about, quoting the church fathers, and I had some quotes too that I was going to share in the next section. They did see a distinction, and the Bible shows a distinction between the human and divine natures. But in LDS thought, they're the same thing. At least it seems like to me. Just different in degrees, different in progression, different in perfection. So they would see that God is the perfected state of man, whereas we are in an imperfect state.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think that's how they would describe it. So I guess my question for Latter-day Saints is, why is it necessary for you to view human nature as inherently divine versus transformed into divine by the work of Jesus Christ, which is the Orthodox Christian view? I think that would be my question to Latter-day Saints. I understand that it's coming from the teaching of Joseph Smith, but from a theological perspective, I would want to ask the question why. So we've introduced into the discussion kind of this concept of intelligences, and this is something that, in many ways, Latter-day Saints view as unique to Joseph Smith. And I'd like to point out that it's not unique to Joseph Smith. It's something that was initially kind of developed within the theology of a man named Origen, Origen Adamantius. I listened to a podcast, and I'll link to a couple of podcasts about Origen. He was born in the year 185 in Alexandria in Egypt. And he was born and raised a Christian, which was unique for the time because at that time the Christian movement was still pretty new. So there weren't a whole lot of Christian families throughout the world. So it was pretty unique for him to have been born and raised a Christian. His father was martyred, and he also wanted to be martyred for his faith. But his mother didn't allow that. She hid his clothes from him so that he couldn't run out into to where his father was being martyred without having to run out naked. So she saved him from martyrdom. But he's considered to be one of the most influential early writers in the Christian faith. The reason for that is he was trained as a philosopher. Plotinus was a fellow student of their Greek philosophy teacher. Plotinus developed Neoplatonism, so his education was top notch as a Greek philosopher. So the way that he thought was Greek in nature in many ways. But he was also committed to the Hebrew scriptures, so the Old Testament. He's important because he did the first, he was a first in several ways. One of those is that he created a work called the Hexapla, which is really, it's kind of like the first textual criticism approach to the Old Testament. He took 6 different sources for the Old Testament text, the Hebrew text, the Septuagint. He had one, I'm trying to remember the others he had, but he had 6 different texts of the Old Testament and put them side by side in columns. A massive work, as you can imagine, with as much text as is in the Old Testament. And his idea was the same as the idea of modern textual critics, was to find the original extant text, right? The first text. Let's recognize that there are differences in translations. In his day, the big differences that were often called out were the differences between the Greek Septuagint, which is the version of the Old Testament that the Christians tended to use, and the Hebrew versions. There were some differences. And so he did this whole text critical work, the Hexapla, which is largely lost to history, but it was very super important during his lifetime. And then the other way that he is a first is he's kind of the first to create a systematic theology of Christian thought. And that work of his is called De Principi. In Latin, it means on first things. And in that work, he develops this idea that, and he does it based on what he sees around him. So we talked a little bit about reasoning from humanity to God, being anthropocentric. That's kind of what Origen did in his reasoning about intelligences, right? He looks around him and he sees that there are varieties of people who, some of whom are more advanced spiritually than others. Some of them are, fully debased in sin and debauchery. Others are more, seem to be more elevated spiritually. And so he asks the question, why would that be the case, right? If God is no respecter of persons, why in this reality, this world we live in, would there be any kind of variation in the level of spirituality of people? And where he reasons from there is very similar to what you find in Latter-day Saint thought, which is, again, something that in modern Latter-day Saint thought is rejected and kind of downplayed. But there's this idea that people were placed into certain circumstances in this life based on what they did or didn't do in a pre-existent life as a spirit, as an intelligence. That doctrine, that kind of thought played very heavily in early Latter-day Saint teachings, even up through the 1960s. It's not a teaching today that Latter-day Saints readily accept, but it is something that Origen reasoned to as well. So if you're interested and you want to see how that plays out in early Christian thought, go read those sections of Origen's De Principi. But Origen's teachings on the pre-existence of souls and some of his other teachings were declared heresy at the Second Council of Constantinople. Some church history scholars argue that the anathemas that are there in the records of the Second Council of Constantinople, that the anathemas against Origen or Origen should not be there because they were actually brought in. Well, it wasn't the main topic of that council. Those anathemas were brought in from a separate synod that had been held, where they had been declared to be heresy, and that they were brought in politically into the Second Council of Constantinople in order to give the whole, primature of the whole church to these anathemas against Origen. So, but just bring that in because I think it's important for Latter-day Saints to understand that these ideas, very few of the ideas that Joseph Smith presented as revelation are unique to him. They have been presented at one time or another by someone else in the history of the church, or some other person who was not a Christian but was a Gnostic or a Marcionite or what have you, that was deemed a heretic. So these ideas are not unique. You can ask the question, how did Joseph Smith know about them? And that's a question worth investigating. But the point is that they're not unique to him. They do show up other times in Christian history. So I just talked for a long time, Matthew. I want to get your thoughts on what I said. I don't hear you.
Sorry about that. I've been trying to have the microphone muted on Zoom, and then I messed it up because I muted it there. Yeah, thanks for sharing that. Basically, we can't say for sure that Joseph Smith got this idea from Origen, but we can say for certain that he wasn't the first to have that idea. So I think it's good to show that background. Yeah, I wanted to share too from the King Follett discourse really quickly, just in case there are some LDS out there that say that we don't, that LDS don't believe that intelligences or that they are eternal with God, because, a lot of times we'll talk to LDS and they'll say, we don't believe that, even though I was taught it all my life. So here in the King Follett discourse, just really quickly, Joseph Smith talks about the soul being eternal. So in that same discourse I shared earlier, he says, quote, "The soul, the mind of man, the immortal spirit, where did it come from? All learned men and doctors of divinity say that God created it in the beginning, but it is not so. The very idea lessens man in my estimation. We say that God himself is a self-existing being. Man does exist upon the same principles." And then later he talks about the Bible. "It does not say in the Hebrew that God created the spirit of man. It says, quote, God made man of the earth and put into him Adam's spirit, and so became a living body. The mind or the intelligence which man possesses is co-equal with God himself." Later he also says, "Is it logical to say that the intelligence of spirits is immortal, and yet that it has a beginning? The intelligence of spirits had no beginning, neither will it have an end. That is good logic. That which has a beginning may have an end. There never was a time when there were not spirits, for they are co-equal with our Father in heaven." Close quote. So that's the entire quote from Smith. So it took different parts of the King Follett discourse. So yeah, I think it's important to note that he did teach this, that spirit intelligences were eternal, and that this premortal existence. And you can find that idea in Origen and in others. I don't know if Swedenborg had that idea. I know that Swedenborg was kind of a big influence on Smith. I don't really know much about his theology, but maybe that's a potential source of his views on, like an inspiration for his views on, the premortal existence. But yeah, we'll talk a little bit more. The essay talks about where he got this first idea about premortal existence. They say that the Book of Mormon could have been a source of that. But yeah, it's a lot of interesting stuff. You're muted also.
Sorry about that. All right, so we've covered the overview. We'll jump into the next section of the essay. What does the Bible say about humans' divine potential? Several biblical passages intimate that humans can become like God. The likeness of humans to God is emphasized in the first chapter of Genesis. God said, "Let us make man in our image, after our likeness." So God created man in his own image. In the image of God created he him. Male and female created he them. After Adam and Eve partook of the fruit of the tree of knowledge of good and evil, God said they had, quote, "become as one of us," end quote, suggesting that a process of approaching godliness was already underway. Later in the Old Testament, a passage in the book of Psalms declares, quote, "I have said, ye are gods, and all of you are children of the Most High," end quote. New Testament passages also point to this doctrine. When Jesus was accused of blasphemy on the grounds that, quote, "thou being a man makest thyself God," end quote, he responded, echoing Psalms, quote, is it not written in your law, I said ye are gods," end quote. In the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus commanded his disciples to become perfect, even as your Father which is in heaven is perfect. In turn, the Apostle Peter referred to the Savior's exceeding great and precious promises that we might become partakers of the divine nature. The Apostle Paul taught that we are the offspring of God and emphasized that as such, we are the children of God, and if children, then heirs, heirs of God, and joint heirs with Christ. The book of Revelation contains a promise from Jesus Christ that to him that overcometh I will grant to sit with me in my throne, even as I also overcame and am set down with my Father in his throne. These passages can be interpreted in different ways, yet by viewing them through the clarifying lens of revelations received by Joseph Smith, Latter-day Saints see these scriptures as straightforward expressions of humanity's divine nature and potential. Many other Christians read the same passages far more metaphorically because they experience the Bible through the lens of doctrinal interpretations that developed over time after the period described in the New Testament. All right, Matthew, thoughts on that section?
Making sure everything's unmuted. Let's see. So yeah, this is kind of what we were taught, at least from what I recall. This is kind of like the standard presentation of how man is like God based on biblical passages, and that's what a lot of Latter-day Saints will use also in our discussion groups, and missionaries will share these same passages and use these kind of same lines of logic. So yeah, there's a lot we could talk about here. I've got a lot of tabs up. Oh shoot, I just closed one. But yeah, there are some. I was reading quotes about people in church history kind of use that same quote in a similar way, where they would say these quotes about how you are gods, and taking that to mean that you can become like God. I was reading a quote from Irenaeus. He said that God had become what we are, that he might bring us to be even what he is himself, close quote. And then he says, he added, quote, "Do we cast blame on him, God, because we are not made gods from the beginning, but were at first created merely as men and then later as gods? Although God has adopted this course out of his pure benevolence, that no one may charge him with discrimination or stinginess, he declares, I have said ye are gods, and all of you are sons of the Most High. For it is necessary at first that nature be exhibited, then after that what was mortal would be conquered and swallowed up in immortality." So, yeah, there are people in church history, I think, that quote that Psalm 82, right? That says you are gods, and use that to demonstrate, or in the belief that God created us to become to become gods. Let's see. There's another quote I had. Clement of Alexandria. He said, "Yeah, I say the word of God became a man so that you might learn from a man how to become a god." And I think that's a very similar quote to Athanasius. I think we've quoted that already, where he said the word was made flesh in order that we might be made gods. So there's this concept of using those same passages in a sense, but there's always this fundamental different understanding of who God is. They didn't look at this and say, oh, God must be exactly like us, just in a better perfected form. So maybe we'll get more into that in the next section when we talk about church history.
Yeah, can you can you read that first quote you wrote? I think it was from Irenaeus. Can you read that again? Because he makes that point, right? That there's a difference.
Yeah. So let's see, Irenaeus. So he was from 130 to 202. He said that God had become what we are, that he might bring us to be even what he is himself. And then he added, quote, do we cast blame on him, God, because we were not made gods from the beginning, but were at first created merely as men and then later as gods? Although God has adopted this course out of his pure benevolence, that no one may charge him with discrimination or stinginess, he declares, I have said, ye are gods, and all of you are sons of the Most High. And then later he says, for it was necessary at first that nature be exhibited, then after that what was mortal would be conquered and swallowed up in immortality. Close quote. So it seems like, yeah, like he's saying that humanity is not the same thing as the divinity, because that humanity needs to be swallowed up in this, and to become what we will become.
Right. Yeah. Really good. He notes that there's this difference, right? That we weren't made in the beginning God, but that's what, that's exactly what Latter-day Saint teaching is, right? Is that by nature we are divine. We are God's in embryo from the beginning, right? We also were in the beginning with God, which is what Doctrine and Covenants, section 92, kind of recasts John 1 as saying. And so we've kind of been asking and kind of walking around a question that I'd kind of like to raise more explicitly right now is, does this teaching that we pre-existed as intelligences, does that do damage to the teaching about the uniqueness of the Logos in John 1? What do you think, Matthew?
Could you repeat that? I need to absorb this.
The LDS teaching that we were in the beginning with God as intelligences, does that do damage to the teaching of John chapter 1 about the uniqueness of the Logos?
Yeah, that's good. That's deep. I think it might. I guess they would explain that. Well, I always believed when I was Latter-day Saint that Jesus was unique in the sense that he was the firstborn son of God, the firstborn literal son. And because of that, he had certain divine prerogatives, including the ability of somehow becoming God without a body, because he attained unto godhood, is what Bruce McConkie would say frequently. He attained unto godhood in his premortal state. And because of that, he was sinless. He was able to to be the savior of man. And so he was special in that sense. But in terms of nature, I don't think you could say he's any different.
Right. Exactly. I will link to as I mentioned, a podcast about Origen. Origen. It's difficult to know which way to say that with the Greek G gamma, but I thought it was interesting in that podcast. I'll just talk about it a little bit. There's a Roman Catholic priest is one of the people speaking in the podcast, and then there's another guy who's kind of like the host, and he seems more like a lay person in the way that he discusses things and asks questions of the priest. So the priest is talking about Origen and his teachings on the pre-existence of souls. And the other gentleman in the podcast, asked the question, well, if that's the case, why would they take on bodies? Right. And that goes directly to the heart of what you were just kind of discussing there, Matthew, is like, could Jesus or Jehovah in Latter-day Saint thought as the firstborn spirit son of Elohim, has this divine prerogative to become God without taking on a body, and therefore is somehow still unique. And that point has been argued to me by other Latter-day Saints when I've raised these concerns. But the question then becomes like the Catholic asks in that podcast, why then would anyone take on bodies? If you're already divine, if you're already deity in nature, why would you take on a body? So I think Latter-day Saints would do well to think more deeply about that question. Some of the other things I wanted to raise from this section of the essay, they quote Peter talking about the exceeding great and precious promises that we might become partakers of the divine nature. Become as in future tense. Again, there's that difference, right, between what Latter-day Saint theology is, that we are already divine in nature, even if you're going to say it's in seed form, and the teaching of the New Testament, which is we become partakers of the divine nature through Christ. And this is why I think it's so important to raise that question about the uniqueness of the Logos. I had a very detailed discussion with Brett Dennis, who we've had on the podcast before, to debate the Book of Abraham. We had an in-depth conversation on our Facebook post about our episode on creation ex nihilo, where he and I went back and forth discussing why John 1, the great prologue, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. Why that is so important in its teaching about who Jesus Christ is. I think I've talked before that my uncle Carl bought my dad a placard that he hung in our home. It was a painting of Jesus on the morning of the resurrection, and it had John 1:1-3 quoted on it. And my dad hung that in our home where I could see it often, and I read it often. And it's something that I thought about and rolled around in my mind a lot compared with what I was being taught as a teenager, as a Latter-day Saint, about the nature of God and the nature of humanity, as discussed in this essay. And realized that there were some core problems for Latter-day Saint theology that are presented there in those first few verses of the Gospel of John. It's absolutely essential that Jesus be unique, that Jesus be God. Humanity cannot be raised to divinity, cannot be raised to immortality, except God come down among us and raise. And the church fathers are very explicit about this. They understood what John was teaching there. Brett ultimately landed when I asked him directly is do you view the Logos as unique? And he said, no, absolutely not. To me, that is a major problem for your theology, because if Jesus is not the unique Son of God, there is no salvation. So the issues that are wrapped up in this essay are pretty severe. The other question I have for you, Matthew, is, they quote from a number of passages here in this section. John 10:33-34, Matthew 5:48, 2 Peter 1:4, Acts 17:29, Romans 8:16-17, and Revelation 3:21. We don't need to look them up and go through them each, I don't think, because they're quoted here, but they kind of brush off Christian understanding of these passages by saying that Christians generally understand these more metaphorically. So I'm going to ask you, do you understand these passages more metaphorically as a Christian?
So like the passages were like in John 10, where he quotes Psalm 82 and he says, "You're gods" and all that. I'm not sure if I don't know. Each one has its own context, so it's kind of hard to really describe all of them. I go back and forth in terms of how to interpret Psalm 82, but at the same time, I understand it in the sense that when God speaks of gods, or the sons of God, when the Old Testament talks about the sons of God, it's talking, it never refers to them as being of the same species or order or likeness as Yahweh, the God of Israel. He's a completely different kind, a unique type of being. So when we talk about these gods or these sons of God, he's not referring to them as if they were of the same order or likeness. They're seen as these subordinate beings, these spiritual creations that are they're subordinate to God's authority and sovereignty. And so we have to understand it in that context instead of saying, oh, here's the word God, so that must be talking just like the God of all creation. We have to take everything in its proper context. And so and the way Jesus used Psalm 82, it could be understood in multiple ways, but it could be understood to say that Jesus was quoting that to say that, okay, it's saying that you, whether it's talking about all of humanity or you as judges in Israel, you in some sense can be called gods. So why is it wrong for me to take on the title, the Son of God? So whether it's saying that you are gods in terms of speaking, of men, or if it's talking about judges in Israel were called gods because they sat in judgment over Israel and as if they were in the place of God. And so why, if it's okay for you to be called gods, why is it wrong for me to call myself the Son of God? That's kind of one way that's been interpreted. So I don't know. I can't really say if it's metaphorical or analogical. It's more just like having an understanding of what does it mean? What does the word gods in that context actually mean? It's like, I don't know. It kind of bugs me sometimes when you talk with, like, even with some other Christians, like in their particular understanding of a passage, they'll be like, well, just read it. You either believe it or you don't believe it, as if like there's no interpretation required, and sometimes that kind of bothers me. So a lot of times when that happens with LDS, they say, well, do you believe it or not? You are gods. Do you believe you're a god or not? I'm like, well, it's a little bit deeper than that. It's not just, are you a god or not? You have to define the terms. You have to take in all your presuppositions as the background of how you understand that text. So I don't know. I didn't really give a solid answer, but it's a complicated issue. You're muted, by the way.
Yeah. Thanks for that. So I just wanted to kind of call out that I don't think it's right for the essay to claim that Christians read these same passages far more metaphorically. I don't think Christians have a theology of glorification of believers, sanctification and ultimate glorification of believers through Christ. And so, to say that we only view these passages, the passages that speak of human potential in Christ, as metaphorical, I don't think that's correct. With regards to the DNC, or not the DNC, the Psalm 82 passage, and where Jesus quotes that in John 10 to those who were critiquing him for taking on the title of Son of God. If he is quoting that to say, look, your law says that you're God's too, so why are you upset at me for saying I'm just one of you? That doesn't make any kind of sense, right? He recognizes that they recognize that he is making a claim about his uniqueness. And he's going to the Old Testament to show them that it makes sense for him to claim this. Now, why it would make sense for him to claim that about Psalm 82 is a question that you can get into quite a bit. There are various views of scholars. Some scholars believe that they were human judges in Israel that were being condemned in Psalm 82. Other scholars believe that they were angels being condemned there in Psalm 82, angels who had been given by God certain responsibilities over peoples of the earth. And so, and that all under the authority of Yahweh, as you were saying, as a unique, uniquely natured being, compared with angels. So, various ways of interpreting that, but it doesn't make sense to me that Jesus would be claiming, hey, I'm just one of you, which is ultimately the way Latter-day Saints read it.
Yeah, and even Eastern Orthodox, I haven't read really long treatises, but like when I read introductions to the doctrine of theosis, a lot of times they'll quote that same passage, and so they'll use that in kind of that's a similar context. But Eastern Orthodox are still very Trinitarian. They don't believe that Jesus was saying, as you were saying, that hey, I'm just like you, I'm exactly like you. I'm a God just like you. Like you're God, we're all divine. They don't say that. They have a very strong Trinitarian theology, but they do believe in theosis, and we'll talk about that later. But yeah, they don't use it in the same sense that Latter-day Saints use it, and that gets iffy because Latter-day Saints will often quote early church fathers as supporting their view of eternal progression. But really, if you understand the context of the early church fathers and of Eastern Orthodoxy, then they would understand that they're kind of abusing those quotes or misusing them.
Right. And that's a good segue into the next section.
We thank you for tuning into this episode of the Outer Brightness Podcast. We'd love to hear from you. Please visit the Outer Brightness Podcast page on Facebook. Feel free to send us a message there with comments or questions by clicking Send a Message at the top of the page, and we would appreciate it if you give the page a like. We also have an Outer Brightness group on Facebook, where you can join and interact with us and others as we discuss the podcast, past episodes, and suggestions for future episodes, etc. You can also send us an email at outerbrightness@gmail.com. We hope to hear from you soon.
You can subscribe to the Outer Brightness Podcast on Apple Podcasts, CastBox, Google Podcasts, Pocket Casts, Podbean, Spotify, and Stitcher. Also, you can check out our new YouTube channel, and if you like it, be sure to lay hands on that subscribe button and confirm it. If you like what you hear, please give us a rating and review wherever you listen and help spread the word.
You can also connect with Michael the ex-Mormon apologist at FromWaterToWine.org, where he blogs, and sometimes Paul and Matthew do as well.
Music for the Outer Brightness Podcast is graciously provided by the talented Brianna Flournoy and by Adams Road. Learn more about Adams Road by visiting their ministry page at adamsroadministry.com. Stay bright, Fireflies.
Lord, to whom shall we go? You have the words of eternal life, and we have believed and have come to know.